Hello, this is Igor Stenmark at MGI Research. We are at the 2021 Monetize Forum Conference. And in our next session, Taming with Churn Beast, we will focus on one of my favorite topics, subscriber retention. So subscription remains kind of a holy grail of modern business. Customers want it, investors value it, and companies are looking for ways to implement it while retaining their sanity, keeping their budget in check, and maintaining their reputation. So great concept, you could say. What about execution? So every year we see in our advisory practice numerous billion-dollar business plans in an Excel model that talk about subscription. And lots of people, lots of companies are very excited about getting it done. And they tend to forget to ask the most important question as we're building up this plan. How do I retain customers? It's not enough to get them to subscribe, but what are the tools and techniques that I need to use, best practices, to really make sure that I have high retention rate? After all, the success or failure of a subscription business hinges completely on its rate on retention. So for this session, we brought together a couple of experts who understand a lot about managing subscriber churn. Steve Booth of Vindicia and Doug Caviness of cleverbridge. So let me do a quick introduction. Doug is the Vice President of B2B Strategy and Partnerships for cleverbridge. His work focuses on sales automation and customer self-service. His specialty is addressing high-velocity, long-tail customer segments. Doug brings over 20 years of experience in e-commerce, software, and IT, having worked with companies ranging from startups to Fortune 500, including Digital River and HP. Steve is a VP of Retention at Vindicia. He is a veteran of the software industry with a career that spans over 30 years in various sales and executive management roles with companies such as ADP, Oracle, Portal Software, and ClickTech. Steve and Doug, welcome to Monetize Forum 2021. A big thank you for participating in the event. We're delighted to have you both as our guests.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
Terrific. All right, guys. So let me open it up and ask you maybe each to do a brief introduction about your respective companies. Maybe we'll start with Steve and then pass it on to Doug.
Okay. Yeah, Vindicia is a company that's part of an organization called Amdocs. We've been around for about 17 years now. And since the inception of Vindicia, we have always been very focused on the direct-to-consumer market. We do that with a product called Market One, which is an all-in-one subscription platform for end-to-end, truly end-to-end subscription relationship management focused on customer acquisition, retention, and growth. Our focus is enabling increases in each of these areas for our customers. We do that primarily through subscription intelligence and also best practices. Obviously today, Igor, as you said, we're focused on retention, which has always been part and parcel to what we do. To the point that my job, as you mentioned, is I am the VP of the retention services here at Vindicia. So I wake up every single day and this is all I do, and this is a focus. So very excited to be here today.
Thank you. Great to have you. Doug, you want to
Igor, thanks for having me. A little bit about cleverbridge. We're a leading e-commerce provider for digital product companies, so namely software and SaaS. We started in 2005, super focused on making it easy for clients to sell globally. And one way we do this is offering what we call a merchant of record model, where we take on a lot of the heavy lifting of things like handling payment contracts, taxes, localization, PCI, and global compliance. And for us today, it's mostly about subscriptions for our clients. We process over 1.5 million transactions a month for companies like Parallels, McAfee, and Sony.
Great, great. So why don't we start maybe with definitions. So how do you guys each define churn and retention? maybe Doug, you start, and then we'll pass it on to Steve.
Sure. So churn is basically a measure of subscription dollars or customers not renewed. So if in the beginning of a term you say had 100 customers, and at the end of the term only 90% renewed, that's 10% of those churned. So the inverse of churn is retention. So if 10% of customers churn, you've retained 90% of your customers. I guess one other thing I just highlight in terms of definitions, a lot of the companies we work with net dollar renewal rate, which would be kind of a measure of the total contract value of all subscriptions set to renew over a given term, plus any upsell and cross-sell. And in that kind of definition, you could actually have, if you had a, say, 90% renewal rate on customers, but for those customers who did renew, you upsold or cross-sold 10% additional dollars, you could have 100% dollar renewal rate.
Steve, did you want to contradict or add anything to that? Or?
Well, definitely not contradicting. Nailed it. In terms of the overall definition, the only additional point, probably diving slightly further on the churn side, is there's an idea of what we call it Vindicia active churn versus passive churn. And you are going to work and focus and handle them each differently. Active churn is, as Doug mentioned, someone, a client fundamentally raising their hand saying, I'm done. I don't want to be involved with your service anymore for whatever reason. We'll talk about that. So that is an active engagement by the customer saying they no longer want to be part of the relationship with you. Passive churn is, we see usually in the direct-to-consumer model, between 20 and 30% based on the customer and the industry being passive churn. And that is actually customers that are lost through failed payment card transactions. Sometimes to me, they're slightly the more painful, right? Because there's one that, it's active and you feel, and the other is just a customer's not saying they don't want to be there anymore, but as Doug mentioned, from a numeric standpoint, they drop out. So that's what we call passive churn. But other than that, Doug's was spot on.
Yeah. I just want to come back to one point with Doug, what you mentioned about revenue retention versus customer retention. And I'll share just a bit of an analyst perspective here. So when we look at companies and try to assess kind of the health of their business, and they tell us that they have 100% revenue retention, we oftentimes discount that because we want to see the actual customer retention. Mm-hmm. So by itself, revenue retention to us is only 30% of the story. We look for, are we retaining customers or are customers fleeing actively from this business?
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It's a great point, because a saved customer is an opportunity, right? If you say, okay, I increased, numbers on one side, but lost the other, that's the opportunity to increase those. You're exactly right. It's a terrific point.
Yeah, because the customer acquisition cost is so high generally in most of his businesses. So if you lose a customer, as you described, Steve, kind of through a customer saying, I don't want to do this anymore, that's, you're basically back to square one, and you have to prepare to spend money again on acquiring a new customer. So the economics are not favorable in that case. Mm-hmm. So looking at the subscription business in general, kind of besides churn/retention, in your view, what are the key metrics that companies should be measuring to help themselves to reduce churn? Maybe we'll start with Steve and then pass it on to Doug.
Well, I'm going to steal one that you just said, and it's kind of an interesting one when you talk about retention, but it is, everybody should know your customer acquisition cost, because in this case, it becomes a customer replacement cost. And, for the vast majority of companies that we deal with in a subscription model, that customer acquisition cost is definitely not a one-to-one, right? It is a multiple of what you tend to get on a billing period basis. So everybody should know that, because that's the number that when you look at and say, what am I, as you just mentioned, Igor, very well, what am I losing when somebody leaves? What is going to cost me to replace that customer? Everybody should know. A second thing that's very important to track and manage, probably a little fluffy, is engagement. And it's tough because, you know, I say engagement like it's this very specific thing, but it's really a lot of times going to be by service, by provider. What does that actually mean, right? So, you know, you need to understand, what does an engaged customer mean in your world? And, you know, you have to be real. You have to manage both positive and negative engagement so that you can understand it. Some organizations or some businesses that are what I like to call in kind of the insurance world, you know, think of like home warranty services or home security services, where there really normally is not an engagement unless there's an incident. In some ways, I think you have to force engagement, right? Make sure you're staying communicated out there. So you have to be able to do that. I would create an engagement scale. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes here. When it gets to payment failures, you know, you want to have a good handle on the metrics. Where are you at? What are you doing initial success rate? What are you doing after retries? Where are you ending up? And it's surprisingly not the easiest number to track, because you get into cohort management and fun, cool statistical terms like that, but you need to do it. And then finally, kind of closing the loop here, retention costs. And I think it's very important to do that because, you know, a lot of people, as you mentioned, Igor, will just assume it's going to happen, and you do need to invest in this. But I can promise you that if you know your acquisition cost, you look at your retention costs, the acquisition cost is going to be by a number of factors higher. So that'll, you know, give you commitment to spending the money and making the investment. They're the high level things that I would really focus on.
Yeah. Doug, anything to add to this?
I think you've hit all the major topics I would highlight. Maybe just to reinforce a couple. You mentioned you focus with your client engagements, Igor, in terms of knowing the account retention. And that relates to customer acquisition costs. A lot of times we see companies not measuring that, and they're acquiring the wrong customers who are likely to churn. So that would be related to that. To Steve's point, I think having measures of engagement and satisfaction are super important. And those are the predictive things that you can actually manage. By the time you get to a renewal event, at least for what Steve called active churn or voluntary churn, it could be too late. So for software and services, often it's the first hours, days, weeks that are going to dictate that customer's likelihood of renewing. So that's the most critical there. And then on the involuntary churn or the passive churn, it's about things like, are the customer's payment details and contact information up to date?
Yeah. I think engagement is absolutely critical. Engagement, and when measuring customer satisfaction, whether it's through direct stat scores or NPS, whatever it is that the company chooses to measure. Without engagement, there's no renewal. Without renewal, there isn't a subscription business. You basically have 100% churn. That's pretty critical. I have a follow-up question for Steve. Steve, you mentioned you focused on the acquisition cost. Is it important, do you think, for companies to kind of track the relationship between the acquisition cost and the value of a subscription on a period? So is there a ratio, a golden ratio? I've seen some companies do that. Have you seen this in your practice?
Absolutely. Yeah, you need to. And I think Doug made a terrific point, right? Because one of those things, you want to dive into that for two reasons, right? You know, the panacea in, you know, what you're shooting for in a subscription model is average lifetime value, increasing average lifetime value. You're going to, you know, one of the things that I remember back, because as you mentioned up front, I'm old. You didn't really say it, but I got the 30-year thing.
It's a compliment. Come on.
It is a compliment, exactly. I still remember in the early SaaS days, someone talking about, you know, migrating to a subscription model and going to their CFO saying, hey, here's this great idea. We've got to go to subscription. We're going to get paid every month. You're going to have visibility into revenue, and it's going to be wonderful. And the CFO goes, that's great. And they said, yeah, the only thing is you got to put all our costs up front. And the CFO, you know, fell off the chair, right? So you've got to, you know, average lifetime value it's a continuum that you need to be focused on. And you want to relate that to your acquisition cost, because if you're not getting the money back, you know, you don't have to be an economic wizard to say that's not working. But then Doug had a great point. which is also evaluating the tranches of your customers to make sure that you are acquiring valuable customers. You know, is there a tranche of customers that are leaving that you should not try to acquire? I know that's heretical in a lot of ways. Some people just believe I can fix anything, I can improve it or whatever. But at some point, you've got to do that analysis and say, if there's a channel that is generating, as an example, customers that just churn off quickly, you've got to look at that level and say, maybe I don't go that route anymore if they're not staying with us, if they're not, if it's not worth it. So absolutely, you want to be literally doing, the old term is cradle to grave, but soup to nuts, whatever you want to do, and make sure you're analyzing that for sure.
Yep. I want to ask you kind of another follow-up to that. We sometimes see companies really accelerate very rapidly from a starting gate. They get fresh funding, fresh talent, they're going, guns blazing. And even though the growth rate is very high in the beginning, the retention begins to really look unattractive very quickly. So we've seen a relationship between too fast of a growth, it's not always the case, and kind of a drop off in retention. Have you guys seen that? Is that something that happens in your practice?
Steve? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. It is unfortunately, I think, more the norm than anything, right? I think that a lot of organizations, especially when you're thinking about starting out, right? There's this thought that, retention is a rich man's problem, right? Oh, or rich person's problem, I should say. I'll worry about that later. And I've always been of the mindset, the minute you have one customer, retention needs to be a focus, right? And it is really important to make sure that, I talked about that engagement scale, that you're literally looking at every single lever there and understanding, is it a customer that's got a risk of churn? What's their engagement like? If it's a happy customer, how do I, back to what Doug's point was, okay, that is one I would like to increase the revenue. Is there additional products? Can I increase their engagement with us? But absolutely, all these things, that failed payments are not just a cost of doing business. You need to be, from day one, making sure, because as I mentioned, the whole idea of the subscription model, from the benefit from a financial perspective, is continual revenue. And if you're losing them at the back end, as we've all mentioned, it's a lot more expensive to replace them. It's cheaper to keep them. We've all heard that term, out in the world, and that's absolutely true in the subscription world.
And I think Steve nailed it. The point is, you got to think through that entire customer experience at the beginning and not defer it as something you get to when you have time or when you get closer to the renewal.
Yeah, when you're thinking about it at renewal, you're way too late. Yeah. But it sounds like there's like really a whole science behind this management of subscriber management and ensuring healthy business in this area. What would be your advice, guys, in terms of for companies looking to improve or maintain their subscriber retention, whether it's in terms of tools, best practices, organizational techniques? Doug, do you want to maybe start with that?
Sure. I guess I have two, and this might be skewed a little bit on what I see in B2B, but I see this as a critical thing, and it's kind of basic. The first one is understanding the critical importance of renewals for your organization. And a lot of times, I don't think that's fully appreciated how important renewals are. I'm remembering a study I saw from Bain about a year ago, and they looked at the software industry. And they found that for software companies, renewals are something like 30 to 50% of revenues, but they're like 50 to 80% of profits. And they had this one statistic that really hit home for me. They said for every 1 point increase in renewal rate or retention rate, that could equate to somewhere between nearly 2% and a 6% uplift in operating income. So I think that's maybe central. Number one is making sure everyone in the organization gets renewals. Number two would be making sure that you're not approaching the customer as silos. And I see this as an ongoing thing, particularly in B2B, where they really need to focus on customer experience throughout that life cycle and making sure that customer experience is rock solid from the very beginning all the way through to the renewal event.
Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I live in an interesting world where I work for a B2B company and we have renewals and we deal with renewals, but our merchants are direct to consumer. So there's a lovely term in the world we live in called evergreen, right? So it's not really a renewal. So that would be my first point, is commit the resources. You know, this does not happen by magic. Yes, you've got a good product. Whoever's out there listening, I know you've got a good product. I know but it doesn't just that's just not enough, right? You've got to make sure you're continually evaluating this. You know, to Doug's point, it's, you know, in the B2B world, it tends to be the bad habit is, oh, okay, renewals in a month. Let's let's dive in, right? So you've got to commit the resources. We talked about the relative nature of the cost of acquisition versus retention. I love, Igor, that, or I'm sorry, Doug, that you mentioned that operating income increase. We have numbers that we use at Vindicia talk about exactly that, even around passive churn, how that top line revenue is just, you know, a multiple of what you're doing. So that's very important. It's a constant process. You know, I mentioned before the engagement scale. There's so many companies out there right now that have a saves team, right? And what's the save? When's the save team dive in? I quit. All right, you know, and what do? We rally the troops. Then we normally throw money at it. I'll give you money off, you know, whatever. You've got to be moving them. That's why I like to talk about an engagement scale, right? This is something that, and we're all consumers. So think about it when you've left any organization, heck, even left a relationship where you've said, I'm leaving. And the other person says, why? And your first thought is, are you kidding me? Like, how clear could I have been that I've got a struggle? A quick little, I had a car I bought when I was young. It was a great model car, great car. It used to shut off while I was driving. The company was great, but every time it happened, they would call back and say, how was our customer service? I said, you know, it's awesome, but there's just too darn much of it, right? So the customers will tell you, right? So you've got to listen to your customers and you've got to move away from it being an event, right? Like Doug said with renewals, like in the D2C world, direct to consumer world, it's on terming. You know, you really want to look at it as a continuum and evaluate everybody and constantly try to move them up the scale. Unhappy to happy, happy to ecstatic. I know it sounds panacea, but you want to do that. And that's something you've got to do and commit to. And I'm going to go back to say again, and I know we're all pounding on it, look at the numbers and you will realize this commitment to doing it is beyond worth it relative to the cost of recapturing or replacing that customer. So yeah, I'm a little passionate about it, but that's what you need to do for sure.
Very cool. So we are almost running to the end of our time slot here at the conference. And I wanted to ask you both, just in conclusion, what are the unique strengths that each one of your companies kind of brings to the table in the context of churn management, subscriber management? What should our audience take away in terms of where they can get help from you guys specifically in this area? Maybe let's do we'll start with Steve and then close with Doug.
Yeah, so from our perspective, I mean, this is from day one, it's been a huge focus of ours. And these days we have products that are focused not just on overall churn, but getting into active churn. So we have a wonderful partner called Redfast that we're working with that is all about not just engagement measurement, which, you know, you've got some things out there, but actions that can be taken both programmatically, but also notification wise that says, hey, here's where this person is as it relates to themselves, not just a broad, we think, but this person's activity versus what they've done before, you know, the ability to do that. The second is we have a product called Retain. We have a wonderful marketing team. How obvious, right? Retain. And that is very focused on the passive churn, where we're able to actually increase the successes between 20 to 30% of otherwise failed payment transactions, very importantly, without getting involved in the customer. That's another best practice is you want to do in that world as much as you can pre-touching the customer, as you can, so that you've got that frictionless experience again for the customer and keeping them active. But that's our, from a very specific retention focus.
Great.
So Doug?
Yeah, and from a churn standpoint, first of all, cleverbridge is super focused on helping B2B and B2C digital product companies on a global basis. So we try to think through and optimize that entire acquisition to renewal process from a transaction standpoint. So we also bring things like retention tools to help prevent things like a card expiration when it doesn't have to happen. We also bring other services like digital marketing services. So in B2B and B2C, Steve would probably tell you one of the most important things is effective communication. So we bring email marketing services, for instance, make sure the customer is enjoying their product and they know about an upcoming renewal event, that sort of thing. So in addition to that, we also provide transaction-based customer service. So if customers have questions, they have problems, they have somebody they can call, or they can go to a self-service interface. So we try to provide that whole experience, regardless if the person's in Japan, Germany, or the United States.
That's very cool. Steve, Doug, we could be talking for much longer. Thank you very much for joining us here at Monetize Forum 2021. And when I remind the audience to go visit virtual exhibit booths at both Cleverbridge and Vindicia hosting, and I hope that you have a great conference. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Igor. Appreciate it. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.